The Groundwork Collaborative did some studies, if I remember correctly, that showed a huge percentage of our inflation was actually a function of corporations just deciding they had the ability to raise the prices for an extended period of time in the wake of COVID. Now, some people could argue, well, the only reason why they were able to do this is because people had more money. They had to increase their savings because of government support, which I suppose that's possible. But were there no COVID, I don't think people would be so readily acceptable of these sudden increase in prices, right? Like, I mean, everybody's going, it's COVID, it's an emergency. So yes, but if you try to do those prices, even if people have that kind of money, without any sort of like international once in a lifetime event to justify it, it's going to be much harder to sell to people about it. I would also add that to a certain extent, our entire conversation about inflation is completely blinkered, because if you are a working person, if you are, so-called middle class, whatever it is, if you're in the 99%, you don't care in a vacuum about the price of anything. You care about the price of something relative to how much money you make and have. It is a dynamic. And to bring down inflation, but also bring down wages and depress wages and employment. And so this dynamic remains, whether it's up here or up here. That only benefits the people who are untethered from their wages going down.
Yes.
And the employment numbers in the capitalist class who are doing the hiring, because they're still up here. So if prices come down and wages come down here, they're still up here, and you get even greater wealth inequality. So just keep that in mind. Our conversation about inflation is really framed and structured by a certain class in this country of extremely wealthy people who have, it is problematic for them, particularly like, financiers and whatnot, and those banks. There's a lot of 3% mortgages out there. There's a lot of 2%,
right,
car loans that the people who extended those loans 4 or 5 years ago are a little bit pissed that they're having to basically, there's much less return than you can get just by putting the money in some online bank. Right. Let's play this clip. This is number 17. Sorry.
Yeah, this is a conversation they had on CNBC. And the question's first posed to a Trump Heritage Foundation guy.
Oh, and Steve Moore is he is just insufferable. And he's
he'll be insufferable in this clip for sure. And then it's a great response here from someone from the Groundwork Collaborative named Lindsay Owens.
A way of where it's not a bad policy to institute price controls when there's something allowing companies to game the system.
Yeah, what's especially dangerous about the idea is she's talking about grocery stores and 7-Elevens. I mean, if you actually have, you'll put grocery stores out of business. As you know, they only have 2 or 3% margins. So you put price controls, they'll go out of business. And people will actually have, not have access to food, which is a dangerous situation. The question, of course, is why they would endorse something so idiotic.
Well, and I think because it sells, I think. Let me get to Lindsay, and that's what everybody's telling me today, is that people want something done. People want something done. And this look, hold on, let me get to Lindsay. Lindsay, is that there's something to that it looks like they're taking some action and they're not really serious about taking it too far with price controls?
Look, I listened to the vice president's speech on Friday, and what I heard is someone who's laser focused on lowering costs for American families, particularly the costs that matter most, the cost of a roof over your head and food on the table. And she laid out a couple of proposals The first thing she said she was going to do is crack down on price fixing by companies like RealPage. This is the data software company that lets corporate landlords collude on rent prices. She said they're not going to be able to do that anymore under my administration. The second thing she said is she's going to do a new federal price gouging ban on food and grocery. This is not price controls. 40 states have price gouging laws on the books. These are red states, these are blue states. This is Idaho, this is Texas, this is Louisiana. Donald Trump did price gouging laws. He used the executive authority he had under the Defense Production Act to crack down on price gouging of medical supplies during the pandemic. So this is a common sense set of policies. We need a new ban at the federal level on the books. But the reason that she's proposing something like this is because it works. She successfully prosecuted cheaters after wildfires in California. We just saw Cal-Maine, the nation's largest egg producer, was convicted at a jury trial of price gouging. Bird flu is a great example. It is ridiculous if your business model is to wait around for the bird flu and really gouge consumers to rake in record profits. By the way, this isn't about bringing supply back online. At the jury trial, what we found out about Cal-Maine is that they were fanning the flames of this supply shortage, exacerbating it. They were culling the flock. They were exporting the eggs to keep the shortage going here at home in the United States. So I think Harris is exactly right to be taking this on. And by the way, if you're a company who relies on ripping off consumers, you ought to be taking a close look at your business model, because this really doesn't speak well of you.
It's exactly right. And just to remind people of this dynamic, inflation during COVID, because there were issues with the supply chain primarily. This was the driver. There were work stoppages. There was difficulty shipping goods because people were dying. People were isolating. Like, it got disrupted. Prices went up 100%. That's what happened. But then gradually, as work returned, the supply chain process began to return to normal. Prices stayed high. And in the final quarter of last year, corporations reported record profits. Now, if this inflation is so naturally occurring, that would not make any sense. The math is not mathing. And what they're upset about is that, particularly these meat producers, just 4 companies now control, this was Robert Reich a few months ago, processing of 80% of beef, nearly 70% of pork, almost 60% of poultry. They have outsized power in the marketplace where they can gouge without, and basically use their power to make record profits in this period. And then they'll just blame inflation and the Democrat in office, because they're also concerned about the antitrust angle. There needs to be a two-pronged approach on this front. Federalizing these price gouging laws, and there's different states have, it ranges from civil to criminal penalties on when they punish corporations or companies within their state for, say, taking advantage of a natural disaster in X state, right? They can't do that. That's on the books in, as she said, nearly 40 states out of 50 in this country. So Harris is proposing to federalize that, and then also hopefully pressure needs to continue to be applied to retain Lena Khan, so you can get at it from the other angle of antitrust, of breaking up this monopolistic power. And that's what's so threatening to, the other guest on that panel.
And just one more word about the way the inflation conversation has gone, because from the beginning, it was clear that this was a supply chain, a production problem, not a demand problem. It was a supply problem, not an overheated demand. Our economy essentially had the capacity, but not the ability in that moment, because you wake up one day and every container that you used to rely on is in places it's never been before. And instead of costing $3,000 to ship, a container to ship whatever it is you're shipping from wherever, it's costing $11,000 or $20,000. And like you say, there are shutdowns that are happening in China. There's a shortage of microchips, and so you get cars backed up. But the story of inflation went from, well, inputs are too high. That's why we're keeping the prices up. And then it just sort of shifted into, well, there's too much money sloshing around. Demand is overheated. But there was no evidence of demand overheated. There was arguably people had a little more savings. But the bottom line is this was price gouging, and the concentration that Emma's talking about, you can see it like in the context. I just remember the story that, I'd gone to get a new inner tube for my bike at a local bike shop in Brooklyn. And the guy's like, I can't get these. And just as an experiment, because like my supplier's saying like they don't have any, but just as an experiment, I went on to Amazon. They had them on Amazon, and I just put in there 95. If I could buy 95 of these from Amazon just to see. And he said I could. And I realized, I went back to my supplier, and they said, Amazon's basically telling us like, we've got to sell it all to them, or they're going to cut us off. And that's the type of market concentration where you see the problematic. And then all of a sudden, Amazon's off to the races. Like, there's a pandemic, there's a shortage of these things, which they created. We can jack up the price. And this is just price gouging. This is not a question of people having more money in their pocket to buy, an inner tube. It's the way that our market is, completely distorted and concentrated market power and economic power. And so
and it's interesting you bring up Jeff Bezos and Amazon because that was where the Washington Post editorial board called that proposal that was laid out there quite, I think, succinctly by Lindsay Owens is they called it a gimmick when, it's quite clear that there's a factual basis behind it. And, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. I don't think it's that direct, but just something to note. And they're also pissed because from the antitrust perspective, the Biden administration has targeted Kroger. They were trying to merge with Albertsons to do, a larger grocery chain. And that's the other end of like why particularly the food and grocer interest groups are so angry and pissed off. And then, she mentioned there as well, that other piece of what Harris is proposing as it relates to housing. There are some things that I think it's a mixed bag, but mostly good of what she's proposed on housing. I still don't love privileging home ownership as a means for economic stability, but in terms of maybe cracking down on these corporate landlords, that's also what they did. These algorithms that these corporations bought up all these buildings and then used algorithms to essentially jack up rents in so many of these units throughout the rest of the country.
That's RealPage. That's what Owens were talking about. RealPage, going after and suing them criminally.
Which they should. So, this is just common sense stuff. And the idea that people are calling this not substantive when the media is calling it not substantive, when Donald Trump is not proposing dick. It's nothing. He's going out there and just talking about how Harris, maybe it is very big. But he's going out there and just posing with Folgers coffee and then ranting about Harris not really being black. It's like, what are we doing here?
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.